A half-priced Voodoo store opened up on campus. Part 2. Part 1 link, Part 3 link, Part 4 link, Part 5 link, Part 6 link. As much as I wanted to go running to tell Brian, I couldn't. For one, I hadn't put my makeup on yet, so that was clearly the first glaring issue. Pulling myself out of bed quickly, I grabbed my foundation and started slathering it on quickly. A million things were running through my head as I did this. How could Creole have dragged himself out of hell? We had a deal with Baron Samedi that made it so that would never happen again. More importantly, how could he have opened up the Voodoo store on campus? Creole may have had deep connections and ways around it back in my hometown. But here, it didn't make any sense at all. But I didn't have time to dwell on the logistics of Creole's return. Hearing the front door opening, I quickly finished up makeup and flung my door open, happy that I had fallen asleep in my hoodie. "Brian," I shouted, only to lose my composure at just how loudly I had shouted his name. He looked back at me with a concerned raised brow, looking down at himself and patting his chest and pants. "Yeah, that's me," he offered lightheartedly. "Pretty sure at least." He gave a chuckle, letting the doorknob go and coming closer to me. "What's up, man? Are you feeling any better?" he asked, probably still worried about how I had just up and abandoned my sandwich. Yeah. I'm doing okay. Where is this place you work at?" I asked quickly before he could try and steer the conversation anywhere else that I didn't want to discuss. He looked at me a bit and offered me a smile. "Thinking about visiting, huh? It's just south of campus." He pointed towards our window as if the store was right outside of it. I followed his finger and made a mental note of that. "I'll be happy to see you there. But don't you have class today?" he asked me with a tilted head. I stared at him and then quickly pulled out my phone and checking the date. I looked back at him with wide eyes. "Shit," I muttered. I was going to be late and I wasn't going to be able to really tell him about the Voodoo shop. "I'll try and swing by this afternoon." Be safe," I told him awkwardly. "Aw. Thanks, man." He chuckled, offering me his fist, which I bumped with a roll of my eyes, feeling dumb for even just saying that. Brian went on his way and I quickly began to round up all of my items for the day. Taking a moment to breathe, I did my best to try and calm myself down. Even if Creole was back, he wouldn't do anything to me when I was in a group of students. Probably holding on to that small hope. I sighed and headed towards my class, making it there before the professor. I took my seat in the middle and laid out some of the items I was gonna be using today, taking a moment to look around to make sure no one was watching. I pulled my phone out to check on my foundation. It was still holding on strong for the time being, which also calmed me down. As I shoved my phone back in my pocket, I finally took notice of the girl who had taken a seat near me. I flinched a bit when we locked eyes, and my face got hot when I realized it was the girl I had given the lead to the day before. "You should use a setting spray," she told me as she looked me up and down. I stared back at her with a look of confusion. She then chuckled and reached into her bag, pulling out a spritz tube and handing it to me. "It'll stop your foundation from coming off when you get hot," she explained to me. Oh. Thanks," I told her, awkwardly reaching out and taking the item to examine it. Then looking up at her with a bit of shame in her, knowing at least a part of my secret. But to my surprise, she just smiled and nodded, going back to her items. Guess Alexandra was right. I did sorta make a bigger deal out of it than it needed to be. The lecture went on. I as usual struggled to keep up with notes and really just struggled to keep my mind off anything but the Voodoo store. It made no sense. Why would he bother opening it up on the campus? Why wouldn't he have just appeared to me and just taken me out like that? Why bother with my roommate? I struggled through the rest of the lecture until at last the professor finished whatever he was talking about. It was time to leave. I quickly started piling everything into my bag. I was stopped by a hand on my shoulder. Flinching hard, I looked back at its owner. Only to see it was the girl again. Sorry. I stammered. Looking up at her and then back at my things. I don't like to be touched, I told her quickly, still shoving things into my backpack. No. I'm sorry. You just seemed so hellbent on leaving without telling me your name. She offered back to me with a smile. I stared up confused at her. My mouth hung open in both shock and awe. Now this was something I wasn't expecting at all. Travis. Travis. I offered her, running my hands through my hair on instinct. She offered a smile to me and chuckled. Riley. Nice to meet you, Travis, she said with a smile before turning to leave. I watched her leave and let a breath out I didn't know I was holding. I awkwardly stared at the bottle of setting spray she had given me and slowly put it into my hoodie pocket. Shaking off the weird encounter with Riley, I quickly made my way out onto the campus grounds and started fast walking towards the south part of campus. A million things on my mind, and soon they were about to be answered. As I walked out into the southern parking lot, I took notice of just how many stores and places were opened and catered towards the kids of the college. From restaurants to department stores. Everything within reach of the campus. Well, if Creole wanted to make money off what he does, then this was certainly better than where the Voodoo shop used to be. Looking around at all of the stores, it was pretty easy to find where the Voodoo shop had been set up. Mostly because there was a sizable sign on a building that read, King Creole's OL Voodoo Shop. I tilted my head at that. In all the forms that the shop had been created, it never had Creole's name first and was never called a shop. Sure, I called it a shop once in a while, but it was always called store. And this one was clearly not half-priced either. All of this was just piling onto my confusion. Heading over, I took a deep breath and opened the front door. What struck me first was how new everything looked. Everything was spotless. And the shelves were actually stocked with items and even had candy and other shit besides voodoo dolls and potions. To say I was confused was an understatement of the century. Maybe even the millennium. Travis. Brian's voice pulled my attention over to the counter. A modern cash register next to him as he put down his phone and crossed the counter to come and meet me. What do you think? Pretty cool, right? He asked me. A big smile plastered on his face. It's certainly not what I was thinking, I confessed to him. My guard still up. But really more scared now than I was in something completely unknown. This wasn't what I was expecting at all. In fact, this was so far from what I was expecting that it scared me even more. Yeah. It's pretty chill here. My boss is pretty cool as well, Brian said, carrying on like nothing was wrong. Which I guess in his mind there wasn't. I meanwhile was losing every single one of the brain cells I still had left trying to figure this shit out. Brain. Is that a customer? An unfamiliar voice asked us from behind a shelf. Both of our attentions turned towards it as a man walked out from behind it. And this was not Creole. The lack of button eyes and stitches really told me as much. Oh. Mr. Brooks. This is my roommate Travis. Brain introduced us as the mystery men closed the distance between us. We looked at each other before the man offered his hand to me and offered a smile to me. Preston Brooks, he told me, shaking my somewhat limp and trembling hand as I stared up at him in complete confusion. Who the hell was this guy? He didn't sound like Creole. Act like him. Nothing. So who the duck was he? Nice to meet you. Quite the shop you have here, I said dryly, trying to pass whatever conversation skill check this interaction needed. Preston nodded and looked around his shop. It isn't much, but it certainly is enough. Anything in particular you're looking for? He asked me, turning his head back to me. Before suddenly he sputtered into a coughing fit. Reaching into his pocket and pulling out a napkin, he coughed into it. Sorry. This damn cough just won't leave me be. He chuckled. No, I'm just here to visit Brian. Where did you come up with the name? I asked him, waiting for him to finish up his coughing fit. When he did, he looked at me for a bit and then looked out towards the window as if thinking the question through. It's my favorite Elvis movie, he told me. I dropped my jaw at him at that. That blew me away. In more ways than one. The fact that King Creole despised that movie and the song that went along with it, and the fact that this man had used it for the name of his voodoo shop. Cool. Brian. I'll meet you back at the dorm, I told him. Really just wanting to get away from here and quick. Oh sure. Thanks for visiting, man, he told me, fist bumping me and going back behind the counter to do his job. I turned to leave. A million things going on in my mind. The sound of Preston coughing was more than enough to get me out the door. I decided to skip the rest of my classes for the day and stumbled back to our dorm room, just at a loss for the events that transpired. Collapsing onto the couch, I just stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything in my mind. There was no way. There were far too many coincidences for this to just be a random new voodoo shop that opened up on campus. It made zero sense to me. I stared up at the ceiling for what only seemed like a few minutes, but the sound of my stomach growling really meant that I had been staring at it for a couple of hours. Forcing myself off the couch, I walked over to the small kitchen area we had. Going through the fridge, I sighed to myself. Not only at the lack of food we had, but because of everything that had happened today. It was like a semi had hit and then made it worse by backing up over me. All those thoughts ended when I started hearing scratching noises. It was subtle at first, but then it quickly picked up in intensity. I slowly closed the fridge door and went about trying to figure out where it was coming from. I thought that maybe a squirrel or something was scratching at the window. But a quick glance quickly dispelled that idea. As I kept listening to the noises, it became apparent that it wasn't scratching. Something was crawling around in the dorm. Walking over towards the sink, I reached in and grabbed a steak knife. It was dirty and had chunks of steak on it. But if something was in here, it was going to do at least some kind of damage to them. And hopefully not damage me as much as I would damage it. Bending down, I checked around to see if a rat or something was crawling around. But as I did so, the sound dampened. So it wasn't on the floor. Sitting up, I looked around like a junkie trying to find his stash. It was starting to get more annoying than scary, and I finally was about to give up when I noticed something. When I moved, I heard the crawling. When I stopped, I couldn't hear it anymore. To test this out, I walked over towards my room. And the scratches followed me. Gripping the handle of my steak knife, I stared up at the ceiling. And two black buttons stared back at me. The Creole from my nightmare was dangling from the ceiling. His claws dug into the roof and had been crawling back and forth, following me as I searched in vain for the source of the noise. Paralyzed by fear, I was unable to act as he unhooked himself from the ceiling and landed on his long, gangly legs in front of me. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he chuckled, his long, gangly body straightening itself out. In this new horrifying form, he towered over me by several feet. The freak was already tall enough, but now he really looked every bit the monster he was. "You can't exist," I mumbled to him, lifting the knife up in some vain attempt to try and defend myself. But he easily slapped it away with his long, gangly claws and shoved me into the bedroom door. He lifted me up to meet his eyes with mine. "Oh, poor little Travis," he mocked me, wrapping those long spider-like fingers around my throat and starting to squeeze it tight, sending me into a sputtering coughing fit, trying to pry them off of me before he did anything to me. Just a puppet without his strings. "Would you like me to fix that?" he snarled, rubbing his clawed fingers along the stitches on my neck. He then dug his claws into it and started to push my head upwards, straining the stitches and sending me into a full-blown panic. Stop it," I screamed at him, reaching out and grabbing his button eyes and tearing them off from his face. He dropped me and flailed around as he growled loudly at me. Reaching down, I grabbed the fallen steak knife and going to stab him, I suddenly was jolted awake by Brian shaking me. "Travis, you okay, man?" he asked me, finally letting me go when he saw that I was in fact conscious again. Jesus, man. You freaked me out. I came in and you were on the floor having a seizure or something," he said, obviously freaking out. I looked around and tried to wrap my head around what had just happened. "Why," I muttered, looking around and seeing that the steak knife was over by the door to my bedroom. Swallowing some, I looked up at Brian and figured now was good enough time to tell him about what I had been through. "Hey, Brian," I told him, once he had calmed down enough to believe that I was okay. "I need to tell you about the half-priced Voodoo store I used to work at. Jesus Travis, these nightmares are getting pretty bad. I wish you much luck as you attempt to tell Brian about your experience. God, I hope he believes you." So, how do we call a hit on this guy? Any practitioners out there? Our boy needs help. Poor Travis, you have been through so much. I wish King Creole would leave you alone already. I just hope other Travis doesn't come back and kills Brian. Smart move, not waiting too much longer to tell him about the store. Dunno how likely he is to believe you. But all you can do is tell him and hope he doesn't think you're stark raving mad. Also, if Creole is back, I'd suggest fighting fire with fire. Or in this case, magic with magic. If voodoo is real, then magic in general must be real also.